Hey, what's up, camera that will have people on the other end of it, sort of, eventually. Today we're going to talk about why paranormal romance, a genre I don't particularly like, is substantially better than romantasy, or fantasy romance, as it was previously known before they were honest with themselves and just decided, okay, yeah, the fantasy doesn't matter. Now, before we get into this, I just want to take a moment to define terms here, because way too many people think that these two genres are the same thing, or even if they don't, they just can't tell the frickin' difference. So I may as well get it out there what I mean when I say paranormal romance and romantasy.
This is the introduction song. It's not very good, but it's not too long.
So I'll start with Pararo. That one has been around forever, both adult paranormal romance and young adult paranormal romance. That has been around forever. The best example of this sort of thing is Twilight. You know, that's a young adult paranormal romance, which blew up 20 years ago, and then had a lot of copycats that came afterwards. Some I've talked about on this very channel before. Paranormal romance takes place in our world, like the real world, with some magical elements in it. Usually hidden. In fact, almost always hidden. And there's one or more normal protagonists. Usually it's just one. Usually it's a girl or a young woman, but not always. And then they will have a love interest who is some sort of supernatural being or is involved in supernatural stuff. Sometimes they'll have multiple love interests who are involved in supernatural stuff. And there's usually an actual plot going through, like there's an actual story there, but that's secondary to all the romance stuff. And the reason that this takes place in our world with magical elements instead of a fully fleshed out fantasy world, I'll get more into it later, but the reason for that is usually just to allow maximum wish fulfillment and maximum projection on the part of the audience. You know, it makes it easier for the audience to put themselves in the shoes of the protagonist and go, oh, she just like me, for real, and imagine themselves one day running into a hot vampire or a hot leprechaun or whatever. Romantasy, on the other hand, is stuff like Fourth Wing and A Court of Thorns and Roses. It takes place in a completely constructed fantasy world separate from Earth, you know. They have stuff like dragons and elves and magic and things like that, and it's usually not hidden. It's just a part of their society and their culture. And the vast majority of the time, romantasy is about the super special main character who has sex with the hottest, most abusive man ever. And the plot still does take a backseat to romance, but these pretend more that the plot isn't taking a backseat to the romance. You know, in Pararo, they tend to be honest about the fact that it's just there for the romance, but in romantasy, they try to pretend that the plot and the romance are equally important, but they pretend really half-assedly. Romantasy is also usually a lot more sexual than Pararo is. At least, again, we're getting into the weird boundary between young adult and adult. Like, plenty of adult paranormal romance can be erotic, let's say, in nature, or just straight-up porn at times, but that's less common, and it's not, you know, mandatory the way it is in romantasy. And in young adult paranormal romance, they're, you know, a lot more chaste. It's a lot less explicit even when sexual stuff does happen. Whereas young adult romantasy will be super explicit for reasons I'm still not sure of.
That's nasty.
Now, obviously there is some overlap between these two genres, but they are overall pretty distinct. Now, recently I read a book called Daughter of the Blood. I didn't do a whole video on it. I did a short, if you're curious. And I don't know if I ever will do a whole video on it, because it's not a great book. Like, it had parts in it that were a lot of fun, and I was entertained throughout, I'll admit. Largely, I was just entertained because it was stupid, but overall, it's not a great book. However, from what I've heard, it did inspire A Court of Thorns and Roses, ACOTAR, and I can see where that inspiration came from. I can definitely see the line between those two. Daughter of the Blood, like I said, it's not very good. The world building is shallow and vague. The plot is scattered all over the place. The characters are generally unlikable and don't have that much depth to them. But it was a quick read. You know, it's only less than 400 pages, at least the copy I got was less than 400 pages. And it does have some funny bits. And there's a good balance, I thought, between the actual story parts and the erotica aspects. Because even though I wasn't really into the erotica aspects of Daughter of the Blood, they weren't really distracting. You know, they weren't what the entire story was about, so I didn't mind them that much. Whereas it was trying to be fantasy and porn at the same time. Whereas Romantasy doesn't actually try to be either one. You know, Romantasy is acting like it's too good for people who read fantasy, or rather it's written for people who think they're too good for fantasy, but it's also for people who think they're too good to just read porn. To put it in terms that the kids understand, the vibes are off, man. And paranormal romance is actually a lot easier to world build for than Romantasy, obviously, because it's literally just our world. You take our world, you have all the real cities, real countries, real religions, organizations, everything in our real world, and then you just tack a few new things on top of it. You know, half the work is already done. And hell, depending on how you do it, more than half the work could already be done. Like, you just take our world, you pick a city. Let's say it takes place in New York City, and then you add vampires or angels or mermaids or whatever else. And it's still possible to screw up world building for paranormal romance. Like, if you add something that just doesn't make a whole lot of sense, like you say, oh, vampires kill 2 million people every year in the United States alone, that just straight up, that doesn't make any sense. Like, people would have noticed and they wouldn't be able to stay hidden. Just as an example off the top of my head, like, you can screw it up, but it's a lot harder to screw it up. Especially because most of the time, Pararo is just utilizing supernatural creatures that already exist and have their own accepted lore behind them. Like, you have vampires, you have angels, you have mermaids, you have whatever else. And so you just take the basic template of, again, let's say a vampire, and that's like, okay, that's a person who drinks blood and burns up in the sun, or at least they're sensitive to sunlight. And then you can add some other stuff on top of that, like, okay, does garlic hurt them? Does silver hurt them? Do they fall in love with humans? Can they procreate with humans? Things like that. And some stories have those elements in them, some don't, but they're all still generally regarded as vampires. So you have a lot of flexibility with what you can get away with here. And it doesn't always work, but you at least understand your limits. And if you are a halfway decent writer, you can make a halfway decent paranormal romance, or at least you can make the world building of paranormal romance halfway decent without trying all that hard. Romantasy, however, has world building that is often equally thin, if not more thin, than paranormal romance, and that's really, really bad, because that just means the entire foundation is set on a house of cards. Now, Daughter of the Blood has bad world building. Like, even by the end of the book, I barely understood what magic was and how it worked in this world. I barely understood what the power struggle was. I barely understood how all these various places that the characters were going to were related to one another, and where they were in relation to one another. Like, it's not very good world building, but it did try. I'll give it that. Like, it was clearly trying to give us information about the way their government works and the different culture of this world and things like that. And again, it's a short book. I feel like it just needed more time. You know, if it had another 50 to 100 pages to really explore some of these ideas and some of these places, I feel I would have had a much better idea of what this world was like, and I feel the setting would have been a lot better. However, a lot of Romantasy is just stupidly long for no fucking reason. So we have stuff like Fourth Wing, which is a lot longer than Daughter of the Blood, and it has even less world building. Like, and what world building is there makes no frickin' sense, but, like, there's very little idea of the culture of this world, the government of this world, how it works. Like, we don't really know much about the war between the two kingdoms that's going on. We barely understand the magic or the dragons or anything. It's just sort of all thrown on the ground, and and the author's pointing at it and going, look, this cool world. And no. Audiences tend to be much more forgiving for bad world building in paranormal romance because, again, it doesn't matter as much if it just takes place in our world with some magical elements. Like, it's much, much harder to screw up. Like, imagine some bizarro world where Fourth Wing was just a paranormal romance that took place in our world, and Violet went to, like, a regular school instead of some weird battle school where they all murder each other in their sleep. God, that book is so fucking stupid. Nothing about it makes any sense. But imagine if instead of that she went to a regular school and there was also, like, some hidden magic and dragons and stuff, just as an example. even audiences that don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about world building like I do can tell that the setting is really, really lazy. So that's the biggest reason why Romantasy just tends to do a lot worse than paranormal romance. And again, I'm not someone who particularly likes paranormal romance. But the next reason is that paranormal romance does often have insta-love for the protagonist and their love interest. They do often fall in love immediately, or at least very, very quickly. But even then, usually, again, not always, but usually, even then, when there's insta-love, the characters will actually spend some time falling in love. Like, they'll be in love, but then they'll still spend time being together and getting to know each other a little bit. Like, recently, I just read Nevermore, and don't worry, I'll get to the rest of the series soon. The first book is not great, but we'll get more into that some other time. And in Nevermore, sure, the characters do fall in love really, really quickly, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but they do at least do things together. You know, the two leads do things together, they spend time together, and you can see that there's a bit of a spark there. Romantasy seems to be inextricably linked to enemies to lovers for some reason, which is really stupid because they're never actually enemies, they're just mildly annoyed with one another for a bit, but they also think they're hot. And that's missing the point of enemies to lovers, because the whole point is that they hate each other and that helps to create sexual and romantic tension. Like, if that was actually being done, I could see the appeal of it, but they're not actually doing enemies to lovers. Like, they just hate each other, they think they're hot, and then they... Paranormal romance, whatever other flaws it may have, at least it does have romance. You can't say the same thing for Romantasy. And honestly, I'd be okay with that if it just admitted that it was porn, because that's what it fucking is, but it never wants to admit that, so here we are. Next reason, Romantasy and paranormal romance both often have chosen one protagonists. You know, people who are somehow special, somehow the center of the world, they have the bestest powers that no one else has, they are just really, really special, and the whole story and the whole world revolves around them simply for them existing. This is dumb in paranormal romance, but it's even worse in Romantasy, because a lot of the time in paranormal romance, the protagonist will be kind of dull and not really do anything. It's not uncommon in these types of books for the protagonist to just sort of stand around and let her love interest do all of the actual heavy lifting, you know, all the fighting, if any fighting needs to be done, and sealing the magical gates or whatever the fuck the story revolves around. Like, usually or not usually, but a lot of times the protagonist will just sort of stand around while they do that, and maybe she'll do one big thing at the climax of the whole series, and that saves the day somehow. And that's bad, but it's even worse in Romantasy because the protagonist will just have special powers and she can just sort of use them. Like, she doesn't have to do any training or practice at all. She's just a badass now. And the authors really, really, really want to lean into the wish fulfillment aspect, so oftentimes protagonist Chan is also a badass fighter. And hey, you can have a story start off and your character's already a badass and they've already done a bunch of training and stuff. That's fine, but even then, you still need to, you know, make it clear that they worked for that and that they've spent a long time and a lot of effort and they've given up other things in the pursuit of that, and Romantasy doesn't do that. Now, don't get me wrong, it's still bad in paranormal romance, but it's less important to the story because they usually don't try to pretend that this is an action heroine, or they don't try to make the protagonist an action heroine, and when you make them an action heroine and just have them be the best fighter and have all the best, coolest, most specialist powers, and they can use them with no effort, that's just not satisfying to read about. And finally, paranormal romance feels professional. Like, even when it's bad, even when it's really bad. Like, I've spent way too much time in my life reading through a bunch of odd Twilight clones that came out in the late aughts and early 10s. And even when they're bad, they at least feel professional. You know, they feel like the author was trying. They feel like the editor actually looked at it and gave the author some feedback and said, hey, why don't you tighten this up, change a couple of things around. They feel like the publisher was actually trying to make something good. They were still chasing a trend, obviously, but they were trying to be good and do something good while chasing that trend. And Romantasy just feels like it's straight from Wattpad. Like, you know, you could take a lot of really popular romantasy books that people have been trying to push on me for years now, and they could have just taken them straight from Wattpad and copy-pasted them and sent them out. Like, that includes things like dropped plots, inconsistent prose, a lot of the time these books will just have different writing styles from scene to scene or chapter to chapter for no real stylistic choice that I can decipher. And it's not uncommon for them to just have straight-up grammatical errors. Again, Fourth Wing had more than one of these. Hello, everyone. I'm back. Several days after I filmed that initial video, and it was already edited and everything, I saw a comment on a different one of my videos, this one right here, which made me realize something, and I have to add it into this, and that's that in paranormal romance, there was a variety in the love interests. There was a variety in the type of supernatural creatures they were. Like, vampires is the big one that everyone thinks of, but there were a lot of angels as well. In fact, there might be more paranormal romance from the early 2010s that features angel love interests or Nephilim love interests than vampires, to be honest with you. But those two were popular. Werewolves, aliens, mermaids. I did a mermaid one just a couple months ago. Like, there was variety here. There were also a lot of boys who just sort of had magical powers, and sometimes they were immortal and way older than the love interest. Sometimes they were about the same age as the protagonist, but other times they were just about their age. The point is, they just had magic powers and were part of some sort of magic underground. So there was some variety here. And like, this goes back to what I was talking about earlier with world building. There's variety here, and it allows the world to expand a little, and it's not always done well, but at least there was clearly, you know, some effort put in, usually. Like, again, I just mentioned the Sirena Legacy. That was not an amazing book series, but that one's about mermaids, and there was some effort put into explaining the Sirena Society and their biology and their history and why they are the way they are, as well as making it clear by the end of that series that humans and Sirena were at some point going to have to reveal themselves to each other, and they were going to have to learn to live side by side. And that sort of story would really only work for mermaids or some other type of weird sea creature that they don't call mermaids for some reason. And Romantasy doesn't have anything like that. They're always just humans or shadow fairies, or some weird combination of all of that. Like, again, we have Grimm from fucking Lightlark, who he's a human, but he's an immortal one, and he has shadow powers, so that way you know he's dark and edgy. And obviously you have A Court of Thorns and Roses, which is kind of the genesis of this whole frickin' genre that's been taking over my entire hobby for several years now. But in that one, it's literally just edgy fairies who sometimes do shadow magic, sometimes do other magic, but let's be honest, it's usually shadow magic. Or, again, Throne of Glass, written by the same fucking person, where it's just an edgy fairy. Like, I don't know if Romantasy authors are aware of this, so if any of you are watching, there are magical powers other than shadow powers. There are other ones you can do. Like, you don't have to literally make their powers be powers of darkness to make them dark and edgy. There's other ways to do it, guys. And pretty much no matter what, whether they're a human, a fairy, or a human, or a fairy, or possibly a human, possibly a fairy, you know, it doesn't matter. Of all the variety we have there, they're always some sort of aristocrat as well. Usually a prince, but sometimes like a king or a duke or lord or something, but usually a prince because, I don't know, reasons. Like, that's like just aristocratic enough to be intriguing and enticing, but not, they don't have any actual responsibilities usually. They aren't actually in charge of shit. I don't know. But, you know, it's always some sort of aristocrat that they're with, and I mean, it just gets old after a while. Like, these love interests, like, I'm not saying that paranormal romance love interests have a wide variety of their personalities, but like, fuck, dude, at least they are sometimes a little bit different from one another. Even if it's just in surface-level details, they're a little bit different from one another. Can you honestly tell me that Xaden from Fourth Wing is a whole lot different than whatever the fuck the other guy's name was in Powerless? Or whatever the fuck his name is in Akatar? Or whatever the fuck his name is in Throne of Glass? Like, can you honestly tell me these guys are a lot different from one another? Because they're not. Like, even the surface level details are all exactly the same. Paranormal romance, like, sure, a lot of the love interests in that are, like, brooding, edgy bad boys, but not all of them. And often when they are brooding and edgy, they can sometimes be brooding and edgy in different ways. Like I mentioned Nevermore earlier. That book, and we'll see how the series continues, because again, I haven't finished it, but the love interest in that book, sure, he's kind of brooding and edgy, but at least there's an actual reason for why he's brooding and edgy, and it's also made very clear that he's a decent person overall. He just is kind of shy and doesn't like talking to people because, again, he has his reasons, but that's just, it's something that would be difficult to get into here. I don't know, man. I feel like this comes back to the really, really lazy world building where they just don't even care and they don't realize that you can do something a little bit different with any of this. And I don't know, I don't want to ramble too much, so I'll just cut back to the original video. I don't have a whole lot else to say on this front, but just paranormal romance feels professional because it feels like the people involved are trying, and even if they're chasing trends and following a formula, they are trying to make something good within those confines that they've set for themselves. Romantasy doesn't feel like it's trying. And ultimately, I think what this all comes back to is that paranormal romance admits that it is romance, and romantasy doesn't. Like, romantasy doesn't commit to anything. It doesn't commit to being fantasy, because if it was committing to being fantasy, it would actually try more with the world building, and it would actually try more with the story, and it would actually try more with the characters. But it doesn't. And it doesn't commit to being romance either, because it doesn't actually show any romance. That was one of the issues I brought up earlier. It just sort of has I'm putting air quotes around this, attention, all the people who are just listening to this in another tab while you do something else, but it has sexual tension, which doesn't actually work that well. Again, Fourth Wing, Violet and Xaden, Violet's just kind of scared of Xaden for no reason, and Xaden is actually super helpful to her, and we're supposed to believe that they're enemies, but there's tension there. It doesn't work on any level, and that's every romantasy book. The only thing they commit to is being porn, because they have a lot of hardcore sex scenes, and that's what the audience is there for. I don't like paranormal romance that much, okay? But there is something to it, okay? There is an actual romance there most of the time. It's not always good, but it's fucking there. There is an actual story there most of the time. Again, it's not always good, but it's fucking there. And even if stuff like Evermore and Nevermore and Everneath, God, these titles are weirdly similar a lot of the time, and Fallen, and, you know, even if the stories for these aren't particularly good, I can at least see, like, okay, they were trying there. They were trying to make it seem like, hey, we have to save the world, or we have to save a chunk of the world, or we have to save some of the people we love, and they came up with magical excuses to do that. So it feels like, yes, it's obviously wish fulfillment in the sense of main character girl falling in love with a super hot boy who loves her despite her not having anything resembling a personality, and she loves him despite also not really having anything resembling a personality. Like, that's obviously wish fulfillment, but there's also wish fulfillment in the sense that she actually gets to help. She actually gets to do things that better the world around her. So while I don't like paranormal romance, there is something to it. And I'll admit, I don't have a strong closer for this video, so I guess buy my merchandise. You can look at it down below, like the video, comment on it, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Goodbye. Hello, if you made it this far, you're one of the elite few who has watched all the way through the video, and now you see these names here? These are the names of my patrons. If you want to get your name here, just send me money over on Patreon. It helps me keep the channel going. It gives you access to, you know, early videos and bonus videos every month and, you know, stuff like that. And my $10 and up patrons are Arthur D. Gonzalez Martin, Brothers Santotis, Carolina Clay, Chibs Ahoy, Ich bin Langweilig, Lexi Delorme, Lord Tiebreaker, Michael and Katie Hake, Mr. A5013, Proscriptions of Dwojang, Rovi, Psych XS, Slumbering Jellyfish Observing Outer Space, Tesla Shark, Toa Michael, Vevictus, and Wesley. All these people, you're all great. If you're not on here, you know, you're still great. I appreciate you watching. Feel free to like the video, comment on it, share it around, subscribe to my channel if you haven't, and, you know, check your subscription box every once in a while if you are subscribed. I don't know why people don't do that, but a lot of them don't. And, you know, just in general, keep on keeping on. Glad you're all here. Have a lovely day. Goodbye.